Hi, Professor. Hi, this is
Good
Layton.
morning. Good
Good
morning.
evening.
Thank you.
Welcome to our online meeting.
Thank you.
And today I'm going to introduce you instead of Professor Hu because he has something else and he cannot attend this meeting.
Okay.
Okay. And will you try to share your screen with your slide?
Yes, let me do that. Sure, I have this going here. No, hold on. It's not the right thing. Hold on. Here we go.
Oh, cool. I think it works.
Yeah, I mean, this is presentation mode and yeah.
Yes, perfect.
So do you want me to stop sharing now and then come back and
Uh, I think maybe later after my introduction.
sure.
Okay. Okay. Then we still have 10 minutes
Yeah,
to
we have quite a lot of time
prepare.
actually.
Yeah. Okay. So see you later.
That's good. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. This is Kai Huang from Shanghai Hospital. Welcome to today's master lecture. I'm going to briefly introduce Dr. Kaye because Professor Hu is not making to come to join us today. So I'll do the introduction first. And thanks for all of your participation this year. And this is our last lecture this year. And I'm going to introduce Professor Kaye. Professor Kaye is the Layton Professor of Neurology and Biomedical Engineering at Oregon Health and Science University. He directs the OHSU NIA Layton Aging and Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, the Oregon Center of Aging and Technology, and the Oregon Roybal Center of Care Support Translational Research, advantaged by integrating technology. Dr. Kaye's long-standing research focus has been to advance methods to sustain healthy brain aging and treat dementia. Dr. Kaye has gained extensive experience in team building and designing, conducting, and analyzing studies of aging and neurodegenerative diseases across a wide spectrum of environments, designs, and approaches, for example, in-home continuous assessment technologies. He leads or he has led several longitudinal studies on aging and clinical trials. The Oregon Brain Aging Study, OBAS, Intelligent System of Detecting of Aging and Aging Change, ISAC, and EVALUE-AD, Ecological Valid Ambient Longitudinal and Unbiased Assessment of Treatment Efficacy in Alzheimer's Disease, and DETECT-AD, Digital Evaluation and Technologies Enabling Clinical Translation for Alzheimer's Disease. And he has served on many national and international panels and boards in the field of geriatric neurology and technology. And Dr. Kaye is listed in Best Doctor in America. He's an author of over 450 scientific publications and holds several major grants awards from federal agency, national foundations, and industrial sponsors. Today, he's going to talk about the using digital technology as the sorry, I cannot complete this topic. Sorry, I forgot to list it in my memo. But let's welcome Professor Kaye.
Thank you. I appreciate the introduction and the invitation to present this morning to everybody here. In my country, I don't know if it's popular in your country, but we generally say, thank goodness it's Friday after a long week. So I appreciate everybody attending on your Friday. I will be sharing my screen here, so let me quickly do that. There we go. All right, so this is the title that would have been spoken. Building Evidence for Digital Technology in Aging and Dementia Research and Care. So I'm going to just start right in by with some background to set the stage. So there are a lot of people around the world are engaged in clinical assessments as well as research, and there's been an approach that's been typical for many decades, and as I'll be trying to point out, these approaches are not ideal. The typical setting we have is that we might assume that there's a problem at home reported by a caregiver or a patient, and then we typically will refer them and see them in a clinic. We take some history, and then this often leads to a number of other assessments, either using questionnaires, cognitive testing, laboratory testing, And one of the challenges of this approach is that it really is limiting in terms of the the whole paradigm. That is, it's very clinic based. It's typically relatively brief. It occurs episodically, and for the patients in particular, can often be stressful. Much of the data is subjective, and because it's the exams are um, uh, very hands-on, it can be obtrusive and inconvenient. And finally, and I think most importantly, this term of being ecologically invalid is really important. That is that we try to equate the history and examination that we got to understand at what's really happening in the real world. And the two are not really always or certainly exactly equal. Now, there's a number of ways that this can be changed. But first, what is the main reason we need to change this? And I will suggest that the real change need is that we are looking for what's meaningful in the person's life. The current scales that we have and assessments that we have are not ideal. Here are just two examples of cognitive testing and more integrated functional cognitive testing. On the bottom left panel as results from the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative cohort study, just looking at the memory scores, composite scores, going left to right of individuals with who are normal, in the middle, who have mild cognitive impairment or MCI, and then early Alzheimer's on the right side. And what is obvious here is that there is a lot of variability in these what are called spaghetti plots, both within an individual. So some people bounce around, they go up, they go down, and then across individuals, there's certainly tremendous variability. If you look at the data plotted over on the right, the CDR or the Clinical Dementia Rating Scale, some of the boxes scores over time, and this is over many months, years, in a Korean longitudinal aging study. What you'll notice, whether people have subjective cognitive impairment, whoops, sorry, I'm trying to go back. Not sure why I'm not able to go back. Hold on. There we go. Again, the same principle is noted whether people have subjective cognitive impairment, amnestic mild cognitive impairment, or early Alzheimer's disease. Now, this variability is not limited to cognitive kinds of assessment or even functional assessments, but also in behavioral assessment. So here I'm showing the unfortunate but commonly emerging psychiatric and behavioral symptoms assessed using the neuropsychiatric inventory, another, in this case, self-reported by a caregiver, in a number of symptoms, whether it's apathy, irritability, depression, agitation, and so forth. Again, the same principle of these kinds of very difficult behaviors, which have been known since Alzheimer's first patient, August Dieter, just shown in the photo on the right. So these symptoms are very variable across individuals as well as within an individual. And if you look with even further, so the prior data, this is actually reported annually. So these are yearly assessments. If you then look at within weeks, even this is data from my colleague in our group, Michael Young, who has developed a methodology using an online app that will that facilitates the reporting by a caregiver much more frequently on all of these multiple behaviors. And the principle I'm showing here, this is just data from 9 patients, but you can see the tremendous variability, both in terms of the different kinds of behaviors, as well as the timing, as well as the intra-individual change. So how can we improve these problems? And what I will suggest and talk mostly about for the rest of my presentation is the idea of changing the paradigm, going from that more episodic, clinic-based, relying on a lot of subjective self-report and difficult to sometimes actually interpret ecologically not valid data, to a system where the data is more home-based, inobtrusively collected or ambient even, that it cuts across multiple domains of function. So it's not just memory, it's not just function or behavior, but all of those areas looked at simultaneously in real time and continuously over time, longitudinally, that the data, because as you'll see, is using digital methodologies, is much more objective, high dimensional, and it really does reflect everyday cognition and function, and thus is ecologically valid. So as you saw in the beginning, you might start with a person who at home noticed to have a problem. And by the way, this photo was sent to me by a patient's daughter who was concerned about her mom because the house was in disarray and her medication taking was concerning to her. So now what we could do is a much more fully featured kind of assessment. We would continue to not ignore the needs or potential opportunities in the older model of taking a history and seeing a person in clinic. And as we all know, particularly with the pandemic, telemedicine and televideo visits, I think, really augment this. But again, those are still brief and episodic and not fully functional. But if we can add in data across multiple important domains of assessment by going into the home directly using technology and look at these various domains of function, not just the health system data, but also cognition, safety, socialization, mobility, physiology, and even the environment the person lives in, then one can take all of this data and integrate it and get a much more valid picture of what's happening in day-to-day life continuously. Now, there are many potential advantages to this approach, and a number of articles have been written on this. Here I've summarized a number of these main points, and I certainly don't have time to go into all of them. I'm just going to highlight 2 of them, and hopefully some of the others will become apparent as I continue my presentation. So, for example, one of the tremendous values of continuous digital data assessment and capture is it can fundamentally increase the efficiency and value of trials themselves, or just clinical studies. So one of the challenges of current episodic in-person or brief visits with the classic tools that we use, assessment scales and tools we use, is we generally require rather large sample sizes for many kinds of clinical studies and trials. And so in the table, the figure on the left, what you see is a graph. The bar all the way on the left, which is labeled as MPAC, this is the one of the now common or classically used modified scales, cognitive scales. So it's basically a collection of cognitive tests that are done in person. And you see in a simulation or a typical trial for a dementia prevention trial, you might need over 1,000 or more in such a trial. If, on the other hand, you were to use a number of different kinds of digital assessments, which I will describe in much more detail subsequently soon. So we're walking speed using either passive sensors or wearables. The reduction in sample size needed is reduced nearly tenfold. Similarly, measuring total sleep time using a wearable, a bed mat, or passive sensors, you have a similar reduction. Monitoring computer use with software resident on computing devices. And then even perhaps more importantly, if you combine these different digital outcome measures, you can really reduce the potential sample size needed. Now, one of the other important features of this approach is that things such as mobility, sleep, ability to use a computer, these are all meaningful measures that relate directly to everyday life. Taking a cognitive test is not something we commonly do, and so interpreting a few points better on on a cognitive scale is harder to understand how meaningful that is compared to these other measures. The other advantage to this is that you not only do you reduce the sample size in terms of the number needed to show an effective treatment, but at the same time, because you need fewer participants, you actually reduce the potential exposure to harm because you need fewer people exposed. This also can be a great advantage, this approach, because you begin to get precise estimates of trajectories of change, which then allows one to look at intra-individual rather than simply group predictions. And then finally, one of the real challenges in our field in general is that in the phase 2 time of a trial where you pretty much establish that a treatment has safety and there's some potential signal for efficacy, but it's hard to know because it's not powered adequately. You can make a better no-go or go decision at this stage without committing to a larger study yet. The second, a second example of the value of digital technology in clinical studies is the potential improvement in the scope, outreach, and engagement of populations. On the bottom is our 3 maps of the US, of the United States. And the bottom left is a map that just colors in the states that have our National Institute of Health Alzheimer's Disease Research Centers. And there are 37 of these. Actually, although they're located in states, they're actually specifically located generally in cities. So their reach is limited to pretty much those people that are around those cities. And there are large parts of the country, as you can see, that don't have such a center available. At the same time, in the middle, we live in a country that's quite diverse by race and ethnicity, and the colors here indicate different racial and ethnic groups. And again, you can see they're dispersed in different densities across the US. If you were to put that map against the other map, they don't align. And so again, we're leaving out potential people from being in research and clinical trials. And then over on the right is a different way of looking at this. That is the number of people or the density of people that live in more rural areas. Again, same principle, the maps don't overlap. So the bottom line is that by being able to use digital technologies that are basically allowing one to continuously capture data using the power of the internet, one can really facilitate farther remote outreach and therefore increase inclusiveness. And one can even look at specific clusters or models of diverse populations as well, and can begin to focus on populations that may not be typically enrolled, but actually are important to understand how they might respond to a therapy. Now, these principles are very important and are key to wanting to move forward more aggressively with digital technologies in research. However, there are still many potential challenges, and I'd like to just highlight a few. One of the largest challenges is this issue of ensuring engagement or adherence to the protocol particularly that when it relies on using digital methodologies. The figure shown here is from a paper by Pratap et al. That was a summary, a review of 8 intervention studies that were based on iPhone apps. And the principle here is these were all different studies in different conditions, such as sleep, depression, asthma, Parkinson's disease. And as you can see, though, the principle here is that although there were literally collectively 100,000 participants initially signed up for these studies because obviously they were online, the challenge was that after about less than 2 weeks, in all of these studies, greater than 50% of the cohorts had ceased engagement with the application or the intervention. And this has been shown in a number of other studies. More recently, in the ADNI group, or not the ADNI group, but a related group, using the CogState brief battery. It's a cognitive test that some of you may know of that's delivered, has typically been delivered on an iPad. So this was done at home. These graphs just show the same principle that very rapidly over time, these individuals were asked to take this test every 6 months at home, and the participation just drops off quite dramatically over time. One of the things that I think is important is to try to understand before one deploys these kinds of methodologies in studies, to understand how people might respond before you go ahead and deploy the technology. In our own center in ORCATECH in Oregon, we have a cohort that is online all the time for research purposes. They're called the RIGHT cohort, or the Response via Internet Technology and Experience cohort. And these individuals were actually asked to experience an online brief cognitive assessment. And in the bottom right, you can see this is part of it. There were only just less than 5 minutes online. So this was a grid memory task where people would look at this grid, and then later they're asked to identify where one of the colored geometric shapes was located. The importance here was simply that we wanted people who'd never done this kind of task online to experience it. And then we asked them, would you be willing to take this task, do this test at different intervals? And the results actually, I think, were somewhat, I have to admit, somewhat surprising to me in one way. But I think the bottom line is that there was not a completely unanimous frequency that they would be willing to take such an online cognitive screening test regularly. The most frequent response was once a week, which I thought was interesting. Actually, once a year was the least favorable. But the other area that I think has become popular, but actually in this study showed clearly that people were not interested in doing this kind of testing multiple times in a day, even if it was just a single day. Another related issue to effectively deploying digital technologies in research is usability. This is obviously important not just in studies, but for any use of technology or any deployment of technology. So ideally, the best technologies are invisible. That is, you're not even aware of them when they're in the background. I mean, your automobile is essentially, many now are essentially computers on wheels, but you're not thinking about what it's doing for you while the vehicle is being driven. In this graphic on the right is just a example of usability considerations where the authors created this interesting application where they took the different pocket sizes of men versus women's pockets and just shows that different devices, different phones, would not really fit very well in pockets of men or women of at different times. And so the principle here is that one has to really think about what are people really doing in their everyday lives, and in a particular research setting in particular, how applicable is what you're proposing them to do in their everyday life, that it would be likely that they would actually be able to complete a task on a regular basis. So there are many opportunities and many methods for capturing digital data. There are hundreds of wearables, even just wrist-worn wearables, let alone wearables that fit on other parts of the body, or even are implanted in the body. As we all know, there are thousands, tens of thousands of devices and apps, either standalone apps or connected to devices apps. There are also many passive kinds of sensing opportunities where, for example, you can use infrared motion sensors, or the device itself may have sensing capability that is not apparent or visible to the participant. And then, of course, in the bottom right is the idea that one ideally would integrate as most useful all of these potential sensing and data capture methodologies. So with all of this available, what is the pathway, what to do? And that brings me to an approach and an opportunity that we have had in our center over now quite a few years, to essentially try to build on evidence of what works and promote or move forward, advance the more durable and successful use of digital technologies in research. And this came about in our country through an initiative of our National Institute on Aging and our Veterans Health System, both major funders of research, who back in 2016-17 decided that there wasn't a lot of this kind of technology, which was showing promise, being used in particularly in geriatrics research. And so we were fortunate to be able to be awarded this a grant to develop further the system that we had already been working on, to create a platform that would facilitate the wider use of digital methods in aging research, but that would be open and very flexible to use cases, and shared and scalable, so that many people could take advantage of this, the community could take advantage of it. And as part of that, it was at first principles realized that it needed to be optimized for unobtrusive as possible, sustained assessment of multiple domains of function and wellness. So what you see in the graphic on the left is a home, because this is definitely home and community based, with major areas of function or domains of clinical assessment that are commonly needed in geriatrics and actually most health research. What we then did was we built on this platform we already had to populate these areas or domains of function with various potential devices and sensing methods, to allow there to be an array of devices and sensors to look at cognition, mobility, sleep, socialization, health behavior, safety, physiology, and indoor environment, all of these things. But for example, it wouldn't necessarily require a particular device. So cognition could be measured on a laptop, a PC, a tablet, a smartphone. It could be measured in a number of ways, by taking a formal test online, of course, as I talked about before, but also just monitoring in the background computer use over time. It also, a device such as a electronic pill monitor that would tell us when a medication was taking can also be a way of looking at cognition in terms of a prospective, that is, seeing how a patient or a person can remember to take a medication or not. So it's actually a memory task as well as a health behaviors or safety task. And I'll describe a few more examples of these in a moment. The other principle is that the conventional assessments and methodologies are still quite important, and these have been integrated into this platform so that one can include the traditional clinical data, imaging, laboratory test data that comes from the historical medical record, as well as other even external data such as weather or pharmacy records, for example. Now, all of this has to be securely sent to a research database, and there's a lot of back-end work that went into doing that appropriately. And then finally, the one thing I really want to also highlight is that this field, the technology moves very rapidly, and so one has to be built to be able to incorporate new sensors or methods as they develop, but also be able to integrate that data with the older methods and sensor data. And I show this graphic very briefly. It's simply to highlight two things. Thomas Riley, my colleague and genius, who basically is the architect, the technical computer developer architect of the system, and also to highlight that what you see in front of generating data with sensors or devices and so forth, there's a very extensive amount of back-end work that has to be developed and maintained over time. Now, this system has been used by many investigators. It was required to be studied and validated in diverse populations. So, a lot of research is done with people who tend to be relatively healthier sometimes, or wealthier, in fact, or more highly educated, certainly in the US. And so in this, using this platform, we studied the usability in 4 diverse cohorts. One was a group of African-American Black older participants residing in Rush, at Rush University in Chicago, in a minority aging research study. There was a group of Hispanic, Spanish heritage individuals, speakers from Miami. There was a group of rural residing veterans in the Pacific Northwest, or in our area of the world, and then a group of older individuals who were of low income, who lived in subsidized, what we call Section 202 housing in the Portland metropolitan area. And just the photos on the bottom are just some of the examples of the passive sensors, the infrared sensors on the wall, the med tracker, pillbox on the wrist is a wearable, and then a bed mat under the bed, and a contact sensor on an exit door. I won't go into detail of the cohort, other to just point out that they were quite diverse, and we were able to demonstrate good adherence as well as data integrity over the course of a year, which was when how this was looked at. Now, some of the examples of the digital technologies, very quickly, how they, the kind of data they can generate. So here are 4 areas of the function, very important for many research studies, whether it's actually Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or even cancer or heart failure. So one is everyday cognition, and we have shown, for example, that one can just simply monitor the number of days on a computer or the number of typical computer sessions over time. And you can clearly see that individuals who have just mild cognitive impairment progressively over time decline in their computer use compared to age-matched controls. In a similar way, one can look at mobility, here looking at gait speed, passively determined with IR sensors, showing that there's a differentiation in the variability of gait speed in those with early as well as later mild cognitive impairment. Social engagement, a very important aspect of chronic disease in general. Here showing the ability to look at a simple measure, time together, time apart, and time out of the home on a 24-hour cycle. This is the circle is a spiral plot, and the colors indicate in a 24-hour sequence over the course of a month. So there's tiny rows around the circle indicating which state the couple was in. And then finally, an example of just several examples of sleep. So one can differentiate people with mild cognitive impairment, amnestic or non-amnestic, and differentiate that they have different sleep metrics. The data in the graph is shown with the passive algorithm, but also one can do this with a bed mat or wearables. And here just showing that one can even consider how two people may sleep similarly or differently together. And I will just say anecdotally, as a clinician, I think sometimes I experience that that the caregiver may be describing or concerned about their person they care for, their sleep, when in fact it's the caregiver's sleep that is actually the problem. Now, one thing that's very, very, very important is the context which the digital data is collected from. It comes in passively, remotely. It's not, nobody's supervising it directly at home. And so we found that it's critically important to get some context data. And the way that we've done this over many years now and found excellent adherence to this approach is to send a weekly questionnaire that lasts 5 minutes or less. Typically, it's about 4.2 minutes to complete. It's force choice, yes, no kinds of answers, addressing these key 13 areas of health or life events or internal feelings or states, like whether a person is feeling depressed or down, lonely, whether they have pain. These can all affect the digital data that one's collecting over time. And if you don't know something more about these changes that are happening quite frequently in a person's life, it really makes it much more challenging to develop algorithms or interpret the sensor data streams. What you see in the graphs over on the right are just an example of how these kinds of external events can, an extreme external event is the COVID-19 pandemic. And here, this is just data from the beginning of the pandemic showing in the top, in the low-income housing cohort, when the state of emergency in our state, Oregon, was announced, the reports of loneliness increased. And then in Chicago, in the state of Illinois, the same phenomenon was observed with the state of emergency being announced. And then in this case, these are step counts with a wearable and showing how those step counts changed dramatically with the pandemic state of emergency declared in Chicago or in Illinois. And this was has shown elsewhere around the U.S. This is data using the platform in Minnesota, another state in the northern part of the United States, showing driving time, highway driving time in particular, in the top panel, dropping with the pandemic and announcement and declaration, and then in the bottom, time on the computer increasing with the declaration of the emergency of the pandemic. Now, one of the important other principles of collecting this data online is that not only does one get the actual reports of what's happening, but there's metadata that can be captured. So one can look at the typical pattern of a finger as it's drawn across the screen. One can, as I said already, can do intermittent testing, of course. One can look at mouse movements or other movements, such as I just mentioned, across a touch screen. The timing, just the simple timing. So the time of day when a weekly questionnaire is completed, it tends to progressively be later in the day for those who have been developing mild cognitive impairment. And then finally, we have the capability of capturing audio and video. This procedure or capability is part of the platform, but requires a special consent. But here again, one can look at not just the response to a questionnaire online that's done via video, but also capture the audio and then analyze that afterwards for things like the number of words spoken or the content even of the conversation. So I'm going to end going through a number of examples, research examples very quickly. So the first is actually an example of just what I was talking about. This is was a study, actually a collection of studies, but this was the main study of called iConnect, which was a intervention to improve cognitive function as well as social engagement in individuals with MCI compared to those who were healthy. It was a randomized design, and the intervention was a 4 times a week a video chat with a trained conversationalist direct to home. And the data was captured, the audio was captured, and the electronic pillbox was used as a functional outcome measure, objectively tested. There was also some other data collected in terms of cognitive changes relative to MRI. But the bottom line is that this approach was very successful. This was some earlier data just showing analysis of the audio and the fact that the participants with mild cognitive impairment generated greater proportions of words compared to their other conversationalists, and that in fact there were certain words that were more commonly spoken in these conversations by those with mild cognitive impairment compared to not the age match, well, they were age match controls, but the control condition. Another example is a intervention to support caregivers of people with dementia who have behavioral difficulties. So here, looking at, first of all, delivering the intervention online, but also then looking at whether the intervention itself was effective using the computer monitoring, sleep monitoring, mobility monitoring, time out of home monitoring, and as more objective measures as to whether this caregiver intervention was improving the behaviors of the patient and the caregiver. And I'm going to skip that for today. This study called the SHARP study is a very innovative study led by Dr. Raina Croft. It is an attempt to enhance the adherence and relevance of an intervention for brain health, which is based on walking among 3 people or a triad in the communities where they grew up, but which have been what we call gentrified, made more expensive, and just transforming the community. And so this intervention, the triad walks in the community with an app which directs them on the walk. So they're getting exercise, they're getting socialization. They pass a old location which pops up a marker, what we call memory marker, which reminds them of events that happened in their past that are memorable for them. And then they discuss it. That discussion is recorded for later analysis. And again, over on the right, these individuals are being monitored at home objectively to see if this intervention is improving their general health as well as their cognitive function and mood. The examples I gave just recently were more cognitive, for people with more mild cognitive impairment, except for the caregiver, obviously. This is just an example of using the same platform in advanced dementia in a memory care unit. So the graphic on the left is a memory care unit's room of a patient outfitted with a set of sensors from the platform and showing the locations of activity where these sensors were monitoring. And then the two graphs on the right simply show agitated nights and non-agitated nights, which were marked by when the patient actually needed to have medication for these agitated events. And so even without statistics, you can clearly see one can detect differences in the agitated versus not agitated nights of this one patient over 115 nights, actually. And so this is very promising, we think, for looking at the efficacy of agitation treatments, as well as maybe being able to prevent agitation from emerging if we can begin to see these patterns early. And then I'm going to end with a few examples of kind of what I would call the future, perhaps. This is work of Qiaoyi Wu, who some of you actually may have met when she visited back in, I think it was January or December, January of this year. Here, what this graphic shows is a dwelling or apartment. On the left is the red circles represent the time that a person is in a particular location in this apartment, and then how they move about. And then on the right, it's the same data or the same person, but here just calculating the data in a different way. That is the average hourly room occupancy. This is actually over a month in this apartment. So what you can see is that there are different ways of looking at the data. It's one of the great values of this kind of data is that it can be analyzed in different ways without having to redo a whole experiment. This data has been used by Dr. Wu to look at whether there are different structures or patterns of the day, so-called life behavior fingerprints of mild cognitive impairment. And indeed, there are. And so these individuals appear to be less likely to leave their home for much time in the morning. They tended to be more likely to leave their home if they were going to leave for a long time in the afternoon. And they were less likely to spend much time in the kitchen, particularly in the evening. This approach is also now being used in a simulated clinical trial where individuals have been are randomized in the sense that the individuals who have Alzheimer's pathology, namely amyloid demonstrated on amyloid PET scans, are considered the placebo group because they have amyloid and they will progress with that amyloid, compared to those who have a negative amyloid PET scan, who are considered the treatment group, if you will, because they will not progress, or certainly not progress at the same rate as those who are amyloid positive. Using this paradigm, we're looking at how a collection of biomarkers, digital, as I already described, along with blood-based biomarkers as well as imaging-based biomarkers. So trying to look at how all of the current biomarkers relate in a trial kind of setting. And then I'm going to end with this. This is an interesting opportunity that I think a lot of us are now becoming more aware of. What you see here on the left is a map of the Northwest, particularly Oregon, with the dots changing colors, and the color changes indicate the air quality based on outdoor air monitors that are part of a public system where the data is available actually online. And what you don't want is purple air. And so these air monitor readings were obtained during wildfire season. This was actually a couple of years ago. However, now unfortunately we tend to have these wildfire periods with smoke and unhealthy air for up to weeks at a time. What's important about this is the air quality has now been found to be actually a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And what we now know, though, is that most of our older people tend to spend most of their time indoors. So these outdoor air monitors may be measuring, what is really bad air, but really what's probably very important is the indoor environment, because on average, most of our older population is spending 2 to 4 hours at most out of their home. Most of their time is in home. And there's now a whole opportunity to look at a number of these environmental risk factors, which can be modified, it's an important fact, over time to understand how these environment factors interact with a person's genetics as well as their other health and life characteristics. And so with that, I'm going to end. I show this map because we've been very fortunate over years to have a lot of collaborators. The red sites are the original CART sites, a study that I mentioned. The orange ones are our National Alzheimer's Research Centers. 5 of them are using this platform. And then I wanted to point out, I took the liberty of over here on the left, putting Taipei and Taiwan on this map, ambitiously hoping that, in fact, we might be able to collaborate in the future. And with that, I'll end, and I think I hopefully have some time for questions. Thank you.
Thank Dr. Kaye for this wonderful, interesting, and inspiring talk. And now it is open for question. Is there any question from the audience? I'm going to ask the first question. As you mentioned, we have to find meaningful measurement from all these device or data. And in different groups, they tend to have diverse, like their daily living, their normal baseline. So how do you decide which group and the definition of this group and the meaningful marker that you want to measure within this group?
So it's a great question. The meaningfulness ultimately, there are different levels of meaningfulness, I think. So on the one hand, there are obviously practical considerations, for example, that the regulatory agencies think about, use. Our FDA uses certain outcome measures. And so I think that often we end up focusing on those somewhat. They do include not just cognitive outcomes, but also functional outcomes. And there are long-standing standard functional outcome scales. One of the things that we've done is correlate the digital outcome measures with those scales so that one has some idea that the digital measures aren't completely, measuring something different. I must say, though, of course, if you say that a bed mat is measuring sleep, that it's hard to argue that, when you say a person is sleeping 8 hours or 7 hours a night, that's not what you've measured, as opposed to when you ask somebody to self-report that. So depending on what the outcome of the study or need is. So for example, in a study of agitation, the outcome measures may be sleep. So disturbed sleep is a major problem, or it may be that the person is wandering or moving about the home too much. It's motor activity is a sign of agitation. So those can be easily measured objectively. So the outcome measure in those cases might be total time in bed. It could be, in addition, the number of room transitions in a day. Um, and immediately you can say you don't need to just be a regulator or a clinician, but a caregiver. You can say, um, your husband or wife is now not moving around the house half as much. And you can show them that, in front of them. You can actually show them a graph that says this is what's happening. It's hard for them to see that in their everyday activity. They're not going to follow the individual around and keep a tally. That would be cruel to the caregiver to make them do that. But you can then do that. The other thing is that the individual's baseline is much more easily determined with the digital technology. So, for example, and that's actually one of the reasons that the sample sizes can be lower, because you can look at what the individual's typical, for example, if you're looking at gait speed, their typical gait speed. So I may walk typically half as fast as you do, but we know what is typical for me, typical for you. So if the metric then is that you are improving by a certain percent, then you very precisely can know for you what that improvement should be compared to what it might be for me. So the ability to actually look at individual baselines and what is expected as meaningful for that individual is also more easily obtained.
Thank you. And Dr. Li Weiru has asked one question. Could the digital data help clinicians to determine the severity of functional decline of patients with cognitive symptoms?
I think yes. So if you look at the different functional measures, what are the different areas of function? So I think classically we divide them into basic activities of daily living and more higher level, sometimes called instrumented activities of daily living or IADLs. So the more complex or instrumented activities, such as using a computer, trying to keep track of medications, driving, those can be measured very precisely over time. And one can very quickly show that a person is not able to keep to their medication regimen. One can easily show that their computer use is changing dramatically over time. One can show that their driving has changed because the data coming from the data port of the car shows that change. In terms of more basic activities, again, one can monitor nighttime activity, and we talked about things like wandering and leaving, even potentially people trying to leave the home. Agitation, as I showed, can be measured. So I think that one can really gauge over time many aspects of function very sensitively over time.
I think there is one more question from the audience. Do you and your team face any difficulty in data storage and patient privacy, since there must be a lot of data from all the devices, apps, and so on? Okay, question from a fifth-year resident of Neurology from VGH, Taipei.
Terrific. So I'm glad to hear that a younger person is interested in and you ask a very good, important question. So the data storage is actually not that difficult in the sense that nowadays there's the data systems are very capable of handling very large amounts of data. Actually, perhaps the more challenging part is processing a lot of data and making sure the data is what we call cleaned and you know, understanding there's often can be missing data or data that is you know, that needs to be accounted for, and so that part is actually an important part and and I would say, you know, is more of a work in progress. That's something that is still an active area of research. The question about privacy comes up all the time, and very appropriately. You know, we have the advantage of all of the data, all of the work that I presented is done under research protocols, and people are signing explicitly consents where we have to explain to them in detail what we're doing, and that includes where does the data go, who has the ability to look at it, and is it you know, is it going to be sold or anything like that? And of course, it's not. Nevertheless, you know, I think I would make the statement that we live in an age where no data can be guaranteed to be 100% secure. You know, even these national security agencies of our governments, I think, are worried about the possibility that data can be compromised. So we do take great care. So the data is at our university, all of the devices, sensors, apps, they all actually undergo a independent security review to make sure that the background security software is in place to make sure that it is as up to date and you know, secure as possible. You know, we use encryption, of course, and we have a number of firewalls to try to, again, further keep things private. But it is a very important and ongoing area of research that needs to be followed.
Okay. Thank you for your answer. And due to the time limitation, I'm going to close this lecture here. And we thank Dr. Kaye again, and thank everybody to join us. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And if you want to ask me a question, I'm happy to have, you can send me an email. And if you want to collaborate, send me an email also. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Have a great day.